So, we had an excellent question that came up last week, and remember what we did is we were defining, well let me start at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning. First of all, you know, we're trying to have a class that's not about opinions, but we're trying to show what we can prove as truth. So the point of this class is, number one, first to learn the tools that can prove truth. And number two, see what we can prove as truth. And number three, use that as a witness tool, as a powerful witness tool, because if you can communicate with people where they're communicating, and you can define things, and you can focus your discussion, your argument in a proper sense, then you theoretically can have a lot more power in how you approach people for Christ, for your witness. In any case, what we had last looked at, last week we looked at private property. That was the beginning. And we showed what the origins of private property is. I mean, it's just a natural fact. We showed by definition the purpose of government. We defined the purpose of government, the provable purpose of government. And then we saw that capitalism is a natural part, a natural economic system. In other words, you know, if you're going to have an economic system, you're going to have capitalism no matter what. And we're going to expand on that a little bit today. But the big deal is, you know, this right now, we're taking what we defined in private property, and now we're going to apply it. So we'll use definitions, we'll use logical arguments, we'll define, see what we can get out of private property, because it's a very important topic. We'll probably follow this next week too. It'll just expand into that, because those are the subjects of our discussion. But in any case, the question that came up was an excellent discussion, and that was about markets. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to start out and talk about markets. So let's just talk about a market. Let's talk about markets. Let's skip to that place, because I've got a bunch of... So let's talk about markets. You know, a market is based in two things. All markets are basically based in price and commodity. Commodity is that thing, and price is how much the thing costs, right? Not the value, but the price in the market. So you always have a price and a commodity. Now, in a barter system, what do you have?
Two commodities.
You have two commodities, but what you have is you have a price and a commodity. They just happen to be represented by a commodity. Capitalism, remember we said, is a natural economic system, because what has directly replaced that other commodity? Labor that is the equivalent of the price, right? Because remember, the whole point last week was, what does money represent? Money represents labor, and it happens to have a value, a commodity value, which is money. Let's get a little bit complex here, but that's okay. If you remember what we defined last week, so the price is equal to a value of money in labor. Because under capitalism, and that's what capitalism is, it's where instead of having a commodity, you now have a dollar, a bill, a piece of money that represents that labor. Before, what represented the labor? The commodity represented labor. So what we're doing in a capitalistic market, and that's what we're talking about here, is a capitalistic market, is we are trading a value in labor represented by money for a commodity. Okay, that's just pure definition. This is the way the world works. In a barter system, you're right. What we do is we have two commodities, and the two commodities represent the values of labor. But what's the problem with two commodities? What fixes the price? What fixes the price of the commodity? The perception of the market. But there is an absolute value. This is what is so cool about capitalism, okay, about economic capitalism, is that the money represents labor. So I can absolutely put a value, and it may be my value, like a barter market, even in dollars. You know, there's barter markets in dollars. We're just talking about, you're talking about, you know, right, people come to a garage sale, and they say, well, I'll give you $1.50 for that, right? You know, The thing is that what they are doing is they are trying to negotiate a price in that market, right? See? So if we keep this straight, we're cool. Now, you can't control a market. You can't control a market. You can't regulate a market. Why?
You'll chase it underground.
But let's see if we can. What happens if we control the price? What happens if, let's say that we do a price control in the market and we set the price, let's say here's the
See, we use a real world example. Let's say a
We can.
hurricane is coming in and you have an anti-gouging law that says
Well,
you can,
let's get a little too complex. Let's start the easy. Let's do the easy, and we can move into to those because that'll be a good example. But let's start with the easy. The easy squeezy is let's say the price of water is $10 a gallon. Okay, $10 1 gallon of water. Okay, let's say, just say. If I set a price control at $9 a gallon, what happens?
You run out of water. You get less water.
Well, let's do it this way. This is even better. Let's do it this way. Let's do it without, let's not have any price controls yet. Let's just say that I have, what happens when the amount of a commodity goes down? What happens to the price?
Goes up.
The price goes up. What happens when the amount of commodity goes up? The price goes down. Can I ever run out of a commodity?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, tell me how I can run out of a commodity.
If it's a finite number.
no.
You can never run out of a commodity. Because as the commodity goes down, the price goes up, becomes more dear, more dear, more dear. Now, theoretically, you could run out of a commodity that is an element, like gold, let's say. Gold is an element. What happens as the price goes up and the amount of the commodity goes down, the price goes up, what happens?
Someone's going to find something else to replace that commodity.
Right.
Someone will either find something to replace it, or they'll find a method to get it. Like, for example, you've heard before there's trillions of pounds of gold in the ocean if we could only recover it. Well, guess what? When the price gets to a certain level in gold, some smart guy or gal is going to figure out how to get that gold out of the ocean. I guarantee you. Because that's the way a market works. You know, and eventually you say, well, you run out of gold. Okay, where do you go next if you run out of gold on the surface of the earth?
Ocean.
Well, after the ocean.
In.
Space.
How about space? Do you know there's unlimited resources in space? Some smart person is going to figure out how to get that gold if the price gets high enough. Some smart person is going to figure out how to get gold out of space, right? The same is true of oil. We will never run out of oil, ever, because the price goes up. It becomes more and more lucrative for someone to invent a process to make oil. Like the Germans, $55 a barrel, you can make your own oil. The Germans did it in World War II. You can make oil. Well, you'll never run out. Because in a market, you never can ever run out of a commodity. Because as a commodity goes down, the price goes up. As a commodity goes up, the price goes down. What does it show when this isn't true? What does it mean?
Some intervention.
Something has intervened. What is the only thing that can intervene in a market? Legally.
Government.
The government. The government. Now this is what we're talking about, price control. So if I control the price of the commodity, and the price of the commodity is $10, let's say a gallon, let's say water, and I set it artificially low, what happens?
Now you have the possibility of running out of water.
You do have a possibility now of running out of water because what happened is there is no incentive to conserve, number one, and number two, there's no incentive to go get more water. Because if you're selling the product below market, is there any incentive to go and do it? So what is that? For example, whenever you hear of water shortages anywhere in the United States of America, what does that immediately tell you? That the government has intervened and we have price controls on the water, which is exactly what happened in, where they have this drought right now? Augusta? Augusta has a drought because it is a government-controlled utility that is underpricing the water and not allowing the price to increase. Right now, for example, the electrical market, even though we have a non-regulated, well, we have a very regulated electrical marketplace, but the electrical marketplace is owned privately, right? But yet, what do they have to ask for the government to increase prices? Permission! Guess what you've done? You have tried to control the marketplace. What does this mean? What do we see every year across this country because the government tries to control the price of electricity? Rolling brownouts. You ever heard of that? You would never ever have a rolling brownout in a free market. The only way you can perturb a market is through the government. Period. So the indicator that you have a perturbed market, that you have a government involvement in market, is when you have the lack of a commodity, when you have a shortage, when you have a drought. You will never, ever, ever have a drought in a free market. You will never, ever get rid of all your gold. Remember what happened? Anybody remember Carter's price controls on gasoline? And what happened? You couldn't get gasoline. Every time they've ever tried wage and price controls. When FDR tried wage and price controls, what happened to the economy? We lived in a depression from 1929 to 1947. It never works. The USSR tried wage and price controls, and guess where they are? The ash heap of history. You can never control a market, because once you try to control it, now, there is one way you can control a marketplace. If you do not allow people to have the commodity. So if the government tries, and then you get a what? A black market. For example, prohibition. For example, drugs. I mean, any illegal substance in this country, the government controls it by saying you can't have it, and therefore you have a black market, you have criminal activity. This is what happens, and I'm not saying that that's good, I'm just saying this is the result of it, okay? What happens with rationing? Rationing is a beautiful example. What happens when I try to ration a commodity? When I ration a commodity, okay, the amount of the commodity goes down, so therefore the price goes up. Now, what if I have a price control on the commodity? Then what happens?
Commodity goes down.
Well, you either run out like we have in Augusta, or what happens in Augusta is they try to ration it. Now this is amazing. Whenever the government tries to ration water, water is a perfect example. What happens when they try to ration water by government fiat, decrees, laws? Anybody know?
People who don't use it usually start using it.
People use more water. Because, for example, when I make a law, they found this in countless times they've done this. Whenever they make a thing, they say, you're even, you get to water every other day, you're odd, you get to water every other day from that. People who would never ever water their lawns start watering their lawns. We know this. I mean, this is not an opinion. This is absolute truth. Now you say, why are our politicians running around like idiots? I can't answer that question. They're idiots. You cannot control and regulate a market. For example, all these regulations they're placing on banking, do you notice in the paper, the first they say we do a regulation, and then what's the next step? People can't get loans. The poor can't get, or for example, they want to regulate the, the loan shark industry, the payday loans. Guess what happens when you regulate payday loans? Guess who can't get loans? People who have no credit, the poor, can't get loans. I mean, if you want that, if you want the poor not to be able to get loans, then regulate the market. But remember, you can't regulate a market because a market is not regulatable. It can't be controllable. If a market, as a matter of fact, how do you know? If a market were controllable or regulatable, how would I know that was true?
It would have worked.
Yeah, you
Well-
have a profit spin.
Number one, it would work. But number two, if I could regulate or control a market, couldn't I make billions by doing that? I mean, you notice how, companies fraudulently have tried to control the market. Usually they get caught, and when they get caught, then they're toast, they go to jail. What's that?
Monopolies.
Monopolies are interesting. I really didn't want to get into that, but I will. I'll mention monopolies. Milton Friedman talks about the three types of monopolies. One is called a natural monopoly, which he says is absolutely, historically, natural monopolies have never, natural monopolies still have to follow the market rules, okay? So let's say there's a natural monopoly. Let's say Standard Oil owns all the oil in America. Guess what? In a free market, what happens if they start jacking the price up really high?
Someone finds an alternative.
Somebody finds an alternative. That's the point of a market, is that the market, when it's free, it's free. See? If the only way you can prevent the alternatives is if the government gets involved, or if, for example, Milton Friedman says there's natural monopolies. He said natural monopolies never show a problem. So a natural monopoly, that is a natural private monopoly where private industry, basically a private industry might take over, a single company might take over all the resource, for example. It can't happen. It's never happened, okay? But it could happen.
Well, and the reason it's a natural monopoly is because it's either so resource intensive or it cannot lend itself to having a lot of people in it. Like the telephone company originally, because they had all the poles up and everything.
That's a different kind of monopoly. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, what he says is exactly right. What you find is, you find, for example, the advent of computers, the advent of radio. There's a million companies making radios and making, computers. And now what happens? Slowly they go away because the winners who can provide the highest level commodity at the lowest price basically win out. And now you only have one or two, right? Or a few. That's natural. I mean, we started with 100 automobile companies in America at the beginning of the automobile age, and today we have like 3, barely, right, in our country. So, but a bunch worldwide. But the trick is, the other type of monopoly is called a semi-government controlled monopoly, or a government-allowed monopoly. A government-allowed monopoly is like Ma Bell. And that is a monopoly like the utility companies, okay, which if they are private, for example, we have a private electrical grid, right, but the government allows monopoly control of that grid. Good for the consumer? I say no. But Ma Bell, they broke up Ma Bell, and guess what? The price of telecom went down significantly. Milton Friedman says probably the least dangerous is the private monopoly. The next least dangerous is one that's government-allowed monopoly. And the third is a government-controlled monopoly. That is socialism. And that is the worst.
GM.
USSR. But yeah, GM, Government Motors for a while there. Who knows what they are now. Airbus. You notice Airbus? Airbus is going under business every year, but they get subsidized by the governments, right? And so they can provide a airplane at a lower price than its value.
Only because the cost, not the price, the cost is not realized.
Well,
It's spread.
the price, you're right.
The cost has been socialized.
The cost has been socialized. But eventually what happens? It's just like what we do in this state, by the way, anything you subsidize, you reduce the commodity. So guess what? We subsidize in this city, what? Airfare for a couple of, 1 or 2 airplane companies. Guess what we have seen in, which way does the chart go for the commodity, that is the number of flights leaving Wichita over time? It goes down because we are subsidizing commodity. That's what you always find, because you can't control a market. You can't regulate a market. It doesn't matter whether you want to or not. If you could control a market, the USSR would still be around, guys. This is an absolute truth. It's a truth beyond truths. Anyone who's studied markets know that markets are not regulatable and not controllable. They just can't be. And then all you do when you try to regulate it is you affect the price and commodity. And when you affect the price and commodity, if you affect the commodity, the price changes. If you affect the price, the commodity changes. If you try to control one, you end up with shortages. And like I said, anytime you ever hear of a shortage, or anytime you hear about too much, what you are seeing is the effects of either bad governance and bad company, or you're seeing the effects of government control. You know, I mean, it's legitimate. Like, for example, companies intentionally, when they have a real bestseller for Christmas toys, what do? They produce, no, they produce an intentional commodity, not enough commodity in the marketplace, so the price is up, right? And the consumer's begging for it, right? Are they controlling the market? No, they're not. The market goes on whatever they do. They want to make the price go up so they reduce economy. So they're working within the marketplace. And is it illegal? It is legal. I hope it's not illegal. Now, here's something, this goes directly into what Dave was mentioning. Whenever the anti-gouging laws. Anti-gouging laws have been shown to be the most disastrous thing that could ever happen. Because in a tornado or hurricane situation, when people really need something, the value of the commodity is very high because there aren't a whole lot of them. So if you need a generator, right? So the government comes in and says, oh, we're going to cap the price of those generators so you can't pay $800 for a $400 generator. Guess what happens to the generators? They disappear because nobody's going to sell them. Because it costs so much to bring them into an area like that. Everybody complains about the price of war. But guess what? If you want to move food into a place where there's no supermarkets, if you want to move generators to a place where there's no electricity, it costs big bucks. You know? It's just a reality of life. Markets govern life. Until we recognize this, we are really idiots. I mean, I'm not kidding. Because if we can't recognize that markets are not controllable, that markets are, they just exist. They're just a natural phenomenon. And you know, what we do is we continue to do what? Try to regulate them, try to manipulate them, try to change them.
You will, by doing that, you move capital away. Because
That's
capital
right.
will go like water to its level. It'll vanish.
You harm when you do this, yes.
It's a good thing they teach a lot of economics in school.
Except Keynesian.
They don't.
In government, I remember that, like, the post office was a legal government-controlled monopoly.
Doing real well.
It is, it's doing well, isn't it? In 1933, matter of fact, this is, in 1833, they made a law during Andrew Jackson's presidency that only the U.S. Post Office could carry first-class mail. Since then, they've been going downhill. Don't you think, look, when HBC had to send 80,000 pages worth of proposal documents and be there the next day, who did they pick? FedEx. You know, the post office won't even guarantee it gets there the next day, right? They say it may get there the next day, right? The thing is that all we have to do to fix this is take the monopoly away from the government. You can't control a market. You just can't. But yet, we make laws, like the post office laws, that make a control in the marketplace. Like crazy. That's nuts. It's just nuts. But, yeah, teaching. You know, teaching basic economics. But the problem is, okay, remember, if you were going to teach basic economics, what would you teach? Capitalism and private property. Because that's the basis of everything. Because remember what we studied last week. If I want to have socialism or communism or fascism, which remember, those are peg words that nobody likes to believe in or hear, but I'm going to talk about it because they're important. If you want to have socialism, fascism, or communism, what do you have to do?
Control markets.
I have to try to control market. In other words, I have to make a law to do it. Because no one would be a socialist unless a law compelled them, right? No one would be a fascist unless a law compelled them. No one would be a communist unless a law compelled them to be, right? Unless you're nuts. Let me talk about this more. This is very important. So, let's move on to, let's just talk about this, because this is very important. If I want to have communism, and remember we defined it. Do you remember the definitions? These are economic. Fascism, socialism, and communism. Remember the definitions? Economic definitions? Because these are economic systems, they are not political systems. Fascism is the control of private property or business through regulation. Socialism is
Ownership or production.
you own it. The government owns. And communism is total control. So, and this is what really bugs me. I've discussed this with people and I say, the government's ownership of GM is obviously what? Socialism. Socialism is not an idea. It's not an ideology per se. It is an economic system. It's an economic system where the government owns business. It's not progressivism. Progressivism is an ideology. There are other ideologies that people confuse, and this is what's so important about definitions. Fascism, again, is the government's control. Now, ultimately, what is the government controlling when they are controlling these things? Labor, but property, private property, because this is what is so important. Your private property, okay? I am private property, okay? My private property is what? My body, right? My labor, right? And everything that I claim to own, or can claim to own, right?
That your body and labor have produced. That's correct.
Well, my body and labor, well, I'd like to say that is so Ayn Randi-ish, I love that, but that's absolutely true. Really your worth and value, okay? Your worth, and remember, we have these different systems. In this system, our worth and value is different because this is a spiritual basis, right? But in law, in history, what is your value?
What you achieve.
What you can produce with your labor. And therefore, the money you have the money that you have is your value. Because money equals labor. I hate to tell you this is the absolute truth, but this is the absolute truth. Unless we're talking about another construct. See? We perturbate systems. And I'm not saying that that's a positive way to value people, right? Because what did we do in our Constitution? How do we value people under our Constitution?
All men are free.
If you're alive, if you're breathing, you're valuable.
That's right. We equate, matter of fact, our Constitution is based in this. Okay, I hope this isn't too much of a leap for people. But everyone wants to say that our Constitution is not based in godly values. If our Constitution was not based in godly values, then what would be the absolute worth of a person?
Money.
Only the value of their labor. Only the value of their money in their pockets. Now notice, our Constitution did give value to private property because it says it protects life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Remember, the pursuit of happiness is code words from the Federalist Papers for the ability to use your private property as you desire. So the code in the Constitution is based specifically on that, but it says, where did those rights come from?
God.
From God. It's amazing to me that someone could look at our Constitution and, like I said, logically, the way, you look at things within a logical construct or a logical ideas, and have any other idea. It just can't be. But in any case, the important thing to note is these are economic systems based in regulation, the government ownership, and in communism, the government owns everything. And you notice how well these work. But the big deal is this. To have these systems, what must be? What is the claim? What is the ultimate claim in all